Right, as the last little bit that we're going to demo on this is how to polish up the feet. And so right now, as we look, the feet are doing their positions, but they're not particularly smooth. So I'm just going to show how to handle that. Here we have the front contacting foot. And what happens right now is it sort of floats down into position semi-weightlessly. By the way, if it helps, you can turn off the translation for this. Let's go ahead and mute that, just so that you can see what's actually happening a little bit more clearly. But really, I tend to just leave that on and not worry about it. But maybe visually this will help a little bit as it's nice and solid now. So you can see that it's just sort of floating weightlessly down during this placement. The contact is the first moment that the heel touched the ground. And very quickly after that, the foot should level out and just kind of stick. But we're easing that foot down towards the ground right now, which would be a bit odd. That would be like you're afraid of walking on something sharp. So let's get it a little bit snappier. We could, in one single frame, place the sole of the foot down. I think I prefer 2 frames. I'm going to go ahead and just eliminate all of the heel roll at that point. And I'm going to exaggerate, oops, not toe roll, toe up, so that on the very next frame, that does flop down. So here's what we've got now. Okay, so just a little bit more snap to how the foot sets down, but it is pretty common that sometimes you'll just go for the very next frame. You can set that down. All right, so then it's held flat for a little bit until frame 8, and we start to push off the ground. This part I don't really feel needs very much of anything. Just going from a flat position to ball up. If you wanted to ease this in or out, we could be using the graph editor for this instead of adding any additional keys. Whenever you can do that, it's probably a good idea. So if we take a look just at ball roll, we can see this is what the graph is doing right now. It's sort of easing in and then kind of tailing off, and then we transfer into midair over here. So if we take a look, maybe we could exaggerate that ease out just a little bit. I don't really think it's necessary, like I said, but that's a possibility. So I'll stick this over on the other screen just in case I want to change my mind. At that point, we transfer to the toe roll, and looking at that, I'm pretty much okay with all of this up until that point. Just checking if it's easing into this position because I don't want it to ease into this position. So here we have ball roll, toe roll. It is kind of easing into that position. I'm going to make this linear, and ball roll, I'll go ahead and leave that one be. Let's see if that, bonk, bonk, bonk. Yeah, so that's actually speeding up now in appearance, which is good. On the very next frame, this is going to be kind of wrong. So that's the part that I do have to fix up. I want to go right from this position to just into the air, one step ahead. And we're also transitioning to not having any of the ball, heel roll, any of that stuff active anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this frame and paste it on 19 right here. And then I'm going to move this back to match that position almost, so that none of these attributes have to worry about transitioning anymore, and our foot can start in the correct position. So that's where we were. Take a close look at where the toe is, because we want the toe to be in front of that position. And the fact that it reverses so violently might be a bit much. Yeah, and in fact, the angle is a bit much. So I'm going to tone that down, bring the toe back to something closer to neutral, raise it up just a bit. Okay. Something like that, so it can peel off the ground and raise into the air. Okay, we want to be aware of the spacing. If I haven't talked about spacing since the bouncing ball video, it is each position frame by frame. So I'm looking at the whole position of the foot, and particularly the tip of the toe, frame by frame, how much difference there is. So if you watch the back of the heel and see how much gap there is frame by frame, just trying to see if I've got a nice pattern. Okay, it's not bad. In fact, I think that'll do. Then by the time we're in midair here, this transition's basically fine because we're going to just completely place our foot from the air down onto this final position. We are at this point using heel roll, but since that transition of heel roll went from here to there, we don't really see any problem with where the diamond is versus where the foot is oriented. It's just all a pretty smooth transition. It does ease in a tiny bit here at the end, but I actually think that's appropriate. You're not going to slam your foot down on the ground. You're just going to kind of glide into position. So I feel that that's okay. Although I do like to delay it up just a tiny bit more typically. No, I think it's fine. Okay. Just wanted to check that. So if we take a look at that portion of the step, seems all right. I'm going to go ahead and unmute this so that I can see it cycle in place. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the controls because they're distracting. So we want to be sure that we're watching the correct foot. It does look a little stilted still in the back of the step. So what I'm noticing is from there to there, it seems a little bit stiff. This foot just kind of holds that position for a little bit too long. And so I want to see what's going on. So we get up into this position for the up. And yeah, okay, so it just doesn't progress very much. I think a longer, slower progression would make sense. So by this point, we could increase the ball roll a bit more. By this point, we could decrease the ball roll a bit and maybe lower the body to accommodate for that. Or we could just leave that leg hyperextended. This should start out pretty slow and then progress a bit smoother. I feel like on this one frame, I want to increase the ball roll even more. And then it kind of hangs out in midair for a moment, and then it progresses forward. So this is where things can be a little bit visually deceptive, given that our character is being translated backward at the same rate that they're moving forward. So things start to jitter a little bit. But in motion, when this is in a game, when it's moving through space, you're probably not going to see that jittering. So it could be a good step to address that. We'll just say that for now that's going to be fine. I do want to check that my hip height is not absurdly high, and we want to look at the knees for any pops. We just don't want them to bend and unbend over and over and over again. We want them to just progress to straight and progress to bent in more smooth ways. So here, the leg is straight. There it's bent, and it gets the most bent right about there or so. Then it comes back to straight and stays straight for a while. There we go. It gradually bends again. That's good. That's not too violent. Maybe a little bit. And then bends a lot, unbends, and goes straight. So the knee progression is actually pretty decent. There's a little bit of what feels like a wobble right in this area when he's mid-air before the step. Actually, I think that's the other knee I'm looking at. This can be a little bit delicate. Last thing that we've never addressed with the feet so far is any side-to-side motion. Right now, It's just locked to a straightforward vector, which is not particularly realistic. So let's get just a little bit of outward swing on the foot as it takes its step. So here on the placement, it's of course going to travel straight back. Then when it pulls off the ground, at about this point, we could either rotate this controller, unfortunately it rotates from the heel, or we could introduce the pivot, which will rotate it from the ball of the foot, which would make more sense. So I'm going to introduce some pivot. So here it's coming up off the ground. I'm going to introduce some pivot just a little bit as it goes to the backmost extreme. That's possible. Even if you have weight on your foot, you can pivot it just a little bit. Okay. And then with this one, where I now have nothing, good, 0, I am going to rotate it. Oh, wait, this is not the position. That would be this one. Okay, so my bad. Let's undo that one. So here I've got pivot. At this point, I should have some pivot as well, facing away from the center of the body. Make sure that that toe has been consistently in place. Yep, it is. So this one now, I will have to rotate to the side a bit and then move it to match up. So let's look at the toe position. Here is the previous frame. If it's a little bit to the left, that's fine because we're heading off. Now I'm going to look in this direction because rotation, yeah, kind of messed that up. Although now I do need to mute this again because it's really hard to tell. Okay, it is traveling forward. And now it's aimed off to the side. Okay, so for this part, I'm going to move that leg out just a little bit, and I'm also going to rotate it like this. So we've just got a little bit of an angle in the midair of that step. This is probably too much. This is, again, like you're wearing oversized clown shoes, but it's just going to give it a little bit of personality. As we come in and place, sometimes I also like to rotate towards the center or rotate out just a little bit during the placement. But in this case, I'll just take this one, move it a tiny bit out, and I'm also going to aim the foot back in towards center just a tiny bit. So it goes from aiming out to aiming in the direction of travel towards the center line again before it places. Okay, it's kind of hitting a hard limit right now as it takes that swing. So I want to take a look at the graph editor. And yeah, we've got some bad tangents in there I can see already. Translate X. Okay, so we do have this single frame transition. That's where I was doing the swap between the internal channels and just the overall object. So I'm going to make that linear so we don't get an incoming tangent handle from that. And I'm going to do that again. And once more. Okay, so now that shouldn't affect anything, and we can just treat that incoming handle as whatever we want. Rotations, actually, we needed to do it for the rotations as well. So linear on all accounts there. All right, so first off, that's what we need to do. Now let's take a look at, probably translate X is the first one. I just want to exaggerate this turnaround a little bit. So I'm going to grab one side and scale the whole thing just to be a bit rounder. And then take this tangent handle. Oh, this one needs to be broken. There we go. To just do that. So it's a nice soft reversal. Same thing here. Break that handle. Probably just aim it up. I could just do it that way. Same thing here. And I don't really know which direction this one's supposed to be going. This is the forward to back. So we don't want to mess with this one too much if it's not necessary. But I'll take a quick look. That looks fine, actually. I won't mess with that one. Let's see if the motion looks a little softer now. Yeah, a little bit more gradual, a little softer. And then I'll just take a quick look at the rotates to see what needs to be done. So X rotation is up, down. This one is orienting left and right. And this is leaning side to side. Okay. I don't really see anything wrong with what it's doing. Yeah, not really. So I'm just going to leave those alone entirely. If it's not broken, don't fix it. The last thing I do need to do, though, is to move the pole vector for the knees, because your foot usually follows your shin. So as we're getting to the extent of this step, I'm going to move that out just a little. Then as we're taking this step and this foot is aiming outward, the knee should be what's driving that. So I'm going to move it outward more. And then at this point, leave it just a tiny bit wider than it started, and then let it come back to the middle at this point that we're coming back into line. There we go. And I don't think there's anything else I want to do with that knee other than that single detour outward. There you go. We can kind of see the difference there. Okay. So the red one is the polished one, the blue one is the unpolished one. Hopefully you can see some difference there. It is pretty fast, and of course it's not cycling now, so it's a little harder to spot. Let's go ahead and unmute that again. A little bit smoother. Okay, just in the service of being as picky as possible, let's handle the knee stuff now. So one of the ways you can handle knee popping is if your character has scalable limbs, this one does, then you can stretch and unstretch it just a little bit to ease the amount of bend in the leg. This is not always possible because your character may not be set up for stretching limbs. But if I, for instance, did that, so we've got a very, very, very slight bend in the knee. And then by this frame, I should probably return it to 0. Or actually, I could continue progressing a little bit, bring it back to something more like that. So now the amount of bend in the knee is much more gradual. And the same thing should be true for here, where we've got a bending leg and then a completely straight leg on this frame. I would prefer to ease that a bit too. So if I turn this up just a tiny bit, so now it goes from this much bend to that much bend. Here, we're going to continue trying to get it towards a straight leg, but by degrees. So I guess that's about as close as I'll get. At that point, I like that one. Yeah, right before that fully straight position. We do want it to hold the straight position for at least a couple of frames. So at this point, I would probably turn it down. Now keep in mind, this is pretty picky stuff that we're doing now. But it can be the difference between a much more beautiful animation progression and a much more ugly and halting kind of animation progression. So what we're looking at is when it's going from bent now, how quickly does it straighten and how violently? That's a nice transition right there, but previously it was pretty bent. We could try to delay that just one more, but like I said, we want to have several frames, if possible, 2 or 3 frames of straight leg. At this point, we have 2 frames of straight leg, 1 frame of transition. I think that's okay. This one's usually the most violent, from straight to putting pressure on. So we want to make sure there's an ease there if we can. You can very, very carefully do this with hip position and foot position. But if you do have a stretch controller on your foot, then it's a little easier. You can see it still looks pretty violent and halting even with those adjustments. But if we start to zoom out, it looks a bit better. And also we've got the visual noise of the other leg in the background, so it makes it a little bit harder to track sometimes. Okay. You also don't want to do that kind of polish until you're completely happy with your upper body and especially your hip motion. Let's say, for instance, that I wanted to give my character more side-to-side motion at this point. That I looked at this walk and I thought, oh, he's not moving, he's not transferring his weight enough. Okay, so I could come into the graph editor, translate X, and I could just scale this graph. If you scale from 0, so I'm going to hit the scale key, I selected the entire thing. I'm going to hold middle mouse down and then shift and go up and down. So this would be more side to side. This would be less side to side. And hopefully he wouldn't be wandering off the spot if I scale from 0. I'm going to look, the maximum amount right now is 1 unit. So we're just going to make it like 1.5 units. So that's 50% more. And I know this graph looks a little scary, but it shouldn't be that bad. What it will do is mess up the relationship between your hips and your feet because the distance will have changed. So you can see, even though that looked like a big, bold change, it didn't really result in a lot more action. That still looks pretty reasonable. In fact, I think that looks better. 2 things now. My hands are not moving the same amount side to side, so I might want to try to add more motion to them. And the distance between my ankles and hips has now changed, which maybe messed up all that detail work that I was trying to do with knee popping. Maybe not, maybe it did. This character does have auto stretch, which should mitigate some of that. It means that it tries to maintain a appropriate amount of bend no matter how far away the foot gets from the hip. Yeah, I don't think I entirely messed it up. It was kind of a subtle change anyway. But I think that's a better amount of side-to-side motion for this character. Might also look at the amount of up and down motion. This is a pretty subdued walk, at least in the upper body. So I could move him up and down. And the last thing I can see is just that maybe the forward to backward in the hips is a little bit bumpy. So we could go through and carefully, pose by pose, try to smooth that out a little bit, especially with this moving him backwards. We can see how far off the center line he moves. And if we use the orthographic view, we can see it even more easily. So at the first and last pose, he's right on the 0 point. Then he's in front further, in front just a little bit further, all the way back. So that's probably where we're going wrong, because we never have a behind position at all. And it didn't ease very well. So this one down would make sense to be in front. This one, passing position, that kind of makes sense to be in front, but at this point, I think we would start to drift backward. So I'm going to take the wrists and the hips, and I'm going to move it back to about here so that our contact is eased back into. So we kind of have one forward point where we go forward by the down and midpoint, and then we start to drift back into line, and then finally we're back into line again. So here's in front of the 0 point. Further, this one I'm going to scoot back, and then we're back into line again. So at least with the hips, that feels a lot better. We've got this kind of soft, round path for his hips. Now that definitely did mess up the knees for a little bit of it, but that's why I say make sure that you're completely happy with your upper body first. Let's try just a couple more adjustments just for the sake of embracing the fact that animation is a revision-heavy discipline. I want to increase the amount of bend on the rib cage and see what happens. I'm not going to change the animation. I'm just going to increase how much there is. So forward to backward is red. It's rotate X. So I'm going to grab the 3 rotate X channels. scale. And again, I'm going to try to scale around 0. Grab everything, line my cursor up on 0, hold down middle mouse and shift, and I'm going to just increase how much. We had about -5 or so. So I'm going to increase it to like -6 or 7. This is degrees, so all told, that's not very much, but you should mentally kind of multiply this by 3 because I've got 3 different ribs selected. So if it was about -5 before, it would have been 15 degrees of change. So if we're at -8 now, then it's about 24 degrees. Or we can always do this with the character visible. So if I undo, let's move our timeline to a place where he's bent more right there. Okay, so I'm grabbing everything and I'm going to scale. So here's more bent, and we ended up like at -10. It's probably going to be too much. The head's going to look really weird. Now, if you ignore the fact that the head looks pretty stupid, the chest doesn't look that bad. There we go. The chest actually looks like it has more life now than it did, and I kind of like it. Yeah, I think I actually would probably keep that. It's just giving it a little extra, especially if we're further away when this animation is happening. I like the amount of shoulder twists that I've got in there. Let's look at the side-to-side motion. Okay, that looks very bad on the head, but keep in mind we didn't polish that. I'm just looking at the torso and how much side-to-side bend I have. I think that's pretty stiff too. So I would like to increase, that is rotate Z. Yeah, rotate Z. So we want Z selected for all 3. Frame it. We're going to scale around 0. And I like doing it more interactively where I've got this visible. I'm doing this right in the graph editor, so none of my animation is changed. It's just exaggerated or toned down. It is usually easier to scale down than it is to scale up, but in some cases for simple kind of harmonic motions like this, you can just scale them up as well. That doesn't feel like too much, really. It's starting to make the shoulders act a little bit weird, and the head, of course, does look weird, but I don't feel like that's too much. We could try to, so let's see, a very bent position here. We could try to increase the amount of side-to-side rotation for the hips as well, because they're kind of intrinsically tied together. So I'm just trying to rotate the hips now until the upper body looks more vertical, hoping that that's going to match up. He looks a bit sassier now. But you know, when I step back and kind of look at it in total, it doesn't look silly. I'm not sure if I would keep it or not. But it didn't ruin the animation or anything to do that. Usually bolder choices are what I try to lean towards because it's too easy to make things stiff and uninteresting, although we are trying to do more default kind of walk. So right now I love the shoulders from the side, from the three-dimensional view. And the body, the head looks stupid because now those positions no longer make any sense. But what we'd have to do is go through the neck and the skull one more time and try to reposition so that it's a bit more reasonable. I think the neck just has too much correction. So the neck bobbing forward and backward, it's a bit too much. That's X rotation. And yeah, actually I see a really large adjustment right in the middle of this cycle. Backward, forward, and then for some reason, a very big sudden drop there just after our contact. So previously, just after our contact, we were kind of in the middle, whereas on this one, it's forward. So I'm going to just move that position down to be more like the opposite part of the cycle. That's not too bad. Now, if I nodded the head a bit more, I think it would be comfortable again. His neck is very, very upright, but then again, so is his chest. What we could do, like if I wanted his neck to aim more forward throughout the entire animation, I could grab these keys and move them down or up. So in this case, up. I'm going to move the entire curve this way. So now throughout, each pose that I had is aimed further forward than it was before. So the amount of motion didn't change, only the overall position of his neck changed. And you know what? I like that. A little bit of forward neck has helped. Now I do think that his head needs a bit more nod. So that would be rotate X. Okay, let's scale this then around 0. That's too much. Okay, so I just hit 10 and I was at 5. Okay, I doubled it. Yeah, that was too harsh. Let's go right about here, about halfway. There we go. Something weird's happening with the side-to-side motion that's making his head jitter. It's probably the neck and the rotate Z. That's a nice smooth curve, but what's happening in the ribs? That's a nice smooth curve. Let's see them together. We can grab all of them. So Z, 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 and Z. So the neck is kind of doing the opposite. Oh, okay. It's doing the opposite of what the ribs do, except look at this frame right here. This keyframe, this extreme, is not on the same frame as this extreme down here. So they're not perfectly mirroring each other. That's probably what's causing a little bit of jitter. Yeah, there we go. Let me show you without that. So I'm going to put that keyframe back and play it again. I'm seeing just some sort of wobbling. Let's see if we can catch it. This is something that could be hard visually to catch unless you were tracking like with the clown nose that we had before, but I saw it in motion as it was playing, a little bit of wobble. But when I take this keyframe and move it over to line up on the same frame as what the ribs are doing, then they're both changing at the same time at the same rate. And so I don't see the wobble anymore. It does make it kind of dart. But now that might be the fact that these other keyframes are on the wrong frame as well. Maybe, or maybe not. No, they look like they're okay. Don't know. I still see a little adjustment that I don't like. But I don't know what to attribute it to. Isolating parts of the body, like just put them off screen and watch the rest of it, or cover it with your thumb or something like that, can be a way to help you track which parts of the body are being fidgety and which parts aren't. But with everything visible, it can be very difficult sometimes. All right, so then we would progress on to polishing the opposite foot. We would fix the arm and hand positions if they were messed up by the fact that I did extra work in the body, and round we go, always polishing towards an end. Last things that we could adjust, we could be folding and unfolding the hands. We could be minutely controlling the position of the hands as they're traveling. We could give them something happening in the face, like a blink or a little bit of soft opening and closing of the jaw, but all of that's probably going to be far too much for this assignment. he is sort of looking up in the air, which is one thing I don't like. So I would probably take this target, and again, rather than just moving it on the single frame, which we could do, we could take the entire curve. In this case, I think it's translate Y, and move the whole curve down just a little bit. So I'd like him to be focused a bit more like here, like a head on the floor. And then with translate Z, it does need to stay in front of his body somewhat, but I'm going to translate this further away. So he's not rotating his eyes as much per step. We'll put it way out here, and then translate Y. Bring it something down like that. So I'll take a look at his eyes now. So it looks like he's focused more forward on his path. Yeah. Okay, something like that. All right. So hopefully that was helpful for understanding all of the steps of a default walk cycle. We follow these steps no matter what sort of character we're trying to create. It's just a question of how we pose those contact and passing positions especially, and how much extra work we do on individual pieces when we're trying to get some sort of character into the walk. So follow all of those steps, get us a nice general default walk. Please do not try to make a character in this assignment. We'll do that in future assignments. Try to make a neutral walk first. It's a lot harder than you think, but you'll learn a lot from doing it. So don't make something that is wildly exaggerated. That's not the aim of this assignment. When you guys are fully done with your walk, all I want you to do is position the camera at about a 45-degree angle, something like this. Okay, and turn off your controls. And then create a play blast. So I've got it set to cram AVI from Windows, fine, at a scale of 1 because my window's fairly big. Just make sure to maximize this before you do it. And then I'll browse and put this in my desktop folder. And give it a name. We'll say walk test. I'm going to hit play blast. And I'm trying to think, should you remove that last frame before we do this? Let's do it with and see if it hiccups at all in my playback. So I've got VLC over here. Oh, can you replay VLC? Okay, VLC is not a good playback platform for this one because it takes so long to load it. So it was a little hard to preview. But when you upload it to Google Drive, we should be able to play it on a loop. I'm just thinking right now, there's one last thing I can show you, which is how to make sure that everything is looping properly. Let's go ahead and just do that. I'm going to make it so that I can extend this timeline 3 or 4 times and still have my animation play back appropriately. First thing I'm going to do is select everything, open the graph editor and hit F to frame. I'm going to select every single curve, all of them, and I'm going to do curves post-infinity cycle. We do have a few different options: cycle with offset, oscillate, linear, constant. We just want cycle. Okay? We shouldn't have to do anything other than that, I don't think. We'll find out. Because our circle is resetting, because our body is resetting. There's the chance that between 29 and 29 and 30, we'll see some error. But let's go ahead and just extend our timeline and see what happens. I'm going to go in 120 frames total, which is 4 different cycles, and then you just subtract 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, there we go. I'm just looking for anything wandering out of place over time. So long as you have a keyframe at the start and the end of your animation, you shouldn't see any wandering. And let's just check now by grabbing like the hips, for instance, and look at one of these. So like here's the up down. We can see the post-infinity. You can see that it's cycling perfectly. So in Maya, if you have a keyframe at the start and end that are duplicates, the graph properly repeats over and over again, so you don't get a duplicate contact position. Not always true in every animation software. Sometimes you'll get a duplicate. But if we take a look at translate Z, it looks like this. That's actually correct in this case because in a single instantaneous frame, we reset, and so does that circle. Your motion blur will probably mess up if you turned it on, so don't turn it on. Just for fun, let's see. Here's motion blur. I want to see if it does mess up. Not in the viewport. I might need to turn on cached playback, so that would be this button here. Cached playback. I'll turn off the controls. Possibly need to turn on some anti-aliasing. I'm trying to enable these render settings to see if we can get the appearance of motion blur. I'm not sure if he's traveling fast enough, really. So this is cache playback. It's not playing at real time, though. Maybe it's not capable. Let me turn that off. We are getting a hiccup at the very end of the playback. It looks like I didn't quite line it up properly in time. Let's see. So here's my hips. And what I could do is just go into my graph editor and see when that reset happens, what frame should we have been on? Well, we should have been on frame 113, it looks like. Okay. 113 would be a perfect loop. Okay, so for your play blast then, try to give me 4 cycles. Give me 113 frames so that we can see them walk repeatedly. That way it will circumvent the looping problems of certain playback systems. Okay, so now I should be able to just right-click Play Blast and replace. There we go, it's making it. And it's popped up on my other screen. And let's replay. There we go. Okay, so that's what I'd like to see, just a single 45-degree diagonal position of your walk cycle. And if you have created a reference file, right, reference editor, before you turn in your Maya file, we just want to click here, right-click, File, Import Objects from Reference. So now this rig file is animated, but don't save this version, just turn this version in. That way there's no references that we need to mess around with. All right, happy animating. If you guys have any questions, be sure to send me a message, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with in your first full walk cycle.